Okay. So the topic at hand is underutilized trees for South Florida. Um, we're in a tropical, relatively, I guess technically we're subtropical, but we're out of the danger of a lot of the freezing that you might get in Central Florida, which some people would term a special kind of hell, because a lot of the temperates fade out at that point, but then they don't have a lot of the real tropical plants available to them because of the fact that it still freezes. Here we're a little more lucky, but the issue is that a lot of people are kind of unfamiliar with like what we have at our disposal, and the fact that we do kind of over rely on a lot of different trees. And the good thing that about the further south that you go, the closer you get to the equator, the more chances there more species and biodiversity there is. It's a general trend. And so we do have more plants available to us than like a lot of our temperate like coworkers, people that like work in the industry further up north. But unfortunately, we do get kind of like tunnel vision a lot of the time. I mean, as do other places in the world, and other places tend to focus on having the same types of trees because it's convenient. And there's a lot of things that go into it: nursery stock, availability, costs. You know, I guess it's the economics of scale for producing a lot of these trees. But what we're trying to do here is kind of bring attention to some of the other plants that are out there. And hopefully down the road, some of these will become less expensive as the knowledge about them is increased, and so is the demand. So really the big reason why we're concerned with tree diversity in a lot of cases is because of the fact that we've had multiple instances within just US history of there being terrible blights or pests or diseases that have come through and just decimated certain tree populations. So here's a picture of American chestnut trees. They tended to be towards the Appalachian region of the country, but they were very large trees, and they provided a huge amount of resources for the people that lived in the area in terms of food. And when they went away, there was a blight that was introduced off of the Asiatic versions of the tree, and like the early 1900s, it wiped out all these trees out, and we're just now getting to the point where they're able to have crossed back and produce trees that might be able to come back and play as pivotal a role someday as what these trees were. So, and similar to that, like there was the Dutch elm disease, and the elm was a particularly popular street tree in temperate areas because of the form that it had, kind of that vase-shaped form, and where they reached up high and then spread out a little bit towards their canopy. Well, this wiped out a lot of the trees, and this happened in the early, like I think about 1930s or 40s. So they lost a lot of the legacy trees in their landscapes because this tree was so overutilized, and then they needed to have a replacement for it. And oftentimes this was the ash tree. So unfortunately, ash trees in the temperate areas have a similar problem now, and that they have a pest that kills them. The emerald ash borer has just decimated those populations throughout the Midwest into the Northeast. So it's still moving. We're not fully at the point of it having done all of its damage, like within the country, but it's basically removed our native white and green ash, as viable trees, like for being used in a lot of the urban landscapes. So potentially the solution to all of that would have been to, if you had a greater amount of different tree species that were planted and not over reliance on just a few species, then the level of catastrophe associated with the trees would not have been nearly as bad for a lot of these places. So, and there are some cities that have done a better job at this than others. If you, I think in particular in temperate areas, like I think Washington, D.C. is known for this, that they plant entire blocks, like one species, but they rotate it from block to block. And so I might be a little bit generalizing here. There are places that have kind of tried to work with this like pattern of increasing diversity, like at different levels throughout their cities. So I'm going to cover just a few concepts here. I think I was getting pretty good results from the polls, so it looks like you guys are a pretty knowledgeable group to start off with. And a lot of this might actually be stuff that you've seen already. But I'm getting all different types of people within these classes as well. So the big thing I want to just talk about here is just tree form, excurrent versus decurrent. So excurrent, central leaders. If you look at the branches tend to have a smaller width ratio, diameter ratio overall relative to the decurrent trees, which you can see the very large branches that come off of this decurrent form. And that's really important in terms of how trees are going to respond to wind and how susceptible they might be to having like a catastrophic type of wind damage occur if they were in a high wind loading event. So you can see this excurrent form is ideal. This is what we want a lot of the time. Some trees naturally grow this way on their own. Bald cypress tends to come to mind. And then the decurrent form, more trees tend towards this. It's not, but with proper training and the right environment, these decurrent trees will have more of an excurrent form. So this is where we come in. Folks that are arborists, like they have a lot of control potentially to shape these trees throughout their lifetime, and it starts early. So I'm just going to cover a few basic characteristics here. I'm going to cover the form, the overall size, because so much of this is just right plant, right place. Just making sure that if you do put in a large tree, that it's going to have the space resources available to it, both below ground and above ground, to grow unimpeded or relatively unimpeded. And if you can't put a large tree in, then it might be a good idea to use a smaller tree. I mean, it's often overlooked, like a lot of areas within the landscape that could potentially have more trees in them. That if we just put more of these smaller trees in, that can make a huge difference potentially. I'll talk about ID features a little bit. So leaves, flowers, fruit, those types of things. And then I'll try and talk about wind resistance. Some of these we don't really know for sure. There's not enough data out there to say like how resistant they are, but I'll give you my best guess based off of like some of the characteristics of those trees, and then potentially site considerations. This is probably the trickiest part because in South Florida we have really different soil depending on where you're at. Up here in Palm Beach, still Palm Beach County, it tends to be pretty sandy still, but once you start moving further south, start running into those really shallow soils that have that are really alkaline, and those can be really tricky to plant in. And so I don't have a lot of information whether like plants are completely suitable for those or not, but that's going to be up to the people that are planting there to know whether a tree is going to make it there or not. I mean, because you've got a couple of things going on there, the pH, and then just also drainage and availability of like space availability for the roots. So the first tree I'm going to talk about here is called wild cinnamon. And its scientific name is Canella winterana. So canela is also in Spanish, that means cinnamon. So you can see where that would come from. It has been grown commercially in the past as a spice tree, but it's generally a pretty small tree. It's not going to get much more than 30 feet. As you can see in this photo here, it lined up pretty well with like planting it right up next to a building and without coming into a whole lot of conflict with that building as well. So it's evergreen. It's got a nice glossy leaf, which is something that we tend to look for here. As long as we're going to be here in South Florida living, it's nice to have evergreen foliage surrounding us all throughout the year. And it's what a lot of people that split their time here are looking for. So the flower, it tends to have a small red flower, and then it'll ripen into a little red fruit in the winter. So you can see here, the fruit that are maturing, and you can even see one of them has matured into a red fruit. It's native to Florida and other parts of the Caribbean. And as far as wind resistance, there's no data out there on this specifically, but it's probably medium to high, somewhere in that range. It has very hard wood, dense wood for its size. And it's also the fact that these smaller trees, they tend to have a lot less ability to build up drag and to be pulled around a whole lot. So that also tends to make them a little bit less susceptible overall. And I mean, then also the other part of this too is the risk. Even if like these trees were to fall over, it's not likely that they would be able to harm nearly as much as like a big branch failure on a large tree. So it is a relatively slow grower, and some of it does have some tolerance to salt, which is good. We always look for that around here along the coast, but not direct spray. And the bark and berries have been grown commercially for their uses. Specifically, like it was listed that like in tobacco that they've spiced tobacco with it, but it's listed as endangered by the state of Florida. So this is one that if you're going out and collecting seeds, you may not want to do that out in a natural area or something like that. It might be okay to be trying to propagate it from some that are already in urbanized areas, but going out and collecting the seed is going to require a permit. But here's just some more pictures. It's got pretty nice showy bark, nice lenticels on it. And you can see this is what the flowers look like too. Okay, butterfly tree. This is one that is not super well known. If you ever happen to see it though, it's kind of hard to forget because there's not a ton of trees out there that produce abundances of flowers. And with that said, I think besides poinciana, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that are going to produce something along these colors. So it is in the Passifloraceae, which is interesting because most of the things in that family are vines. This is the passion flower family. And overall, the form, it only gets to be about 20 feet high. So again, this is another small one. It's got really simple leaves, somewhat serrate margins, and it blooms in the dry season. So technically we're kind of in the dry season right now, but in South Florida, it tends to peak in late winter. So I think maybe the end of January, February, March, somewhere in there is when it's going to be at its peak. And the fruit, it does have a small woody capsule. Apparently there is some use for that for wildlife as well. So I try to provide pictures of the trees, of these same trees, like without their flowers a lot of the times. Obviously, for the purposes of this presentation, I gravitated subconsciously. I realized this afterwards towards providing picking out trees that actually flower quite a bit because they're a little bit more stunning. There's a little bit more, I mean, it adds some element of seasonality, and it just is nice to show these photos of flowering trees. But generally, most of these trees, that's not how they're going to look throughout most of the year. So I've tried to make an effort to kind of show you what these trees will look like when they're not flowering. So here it is. It's a kind of inconspicuous tree. It's just a small little evergreen like most of the year. And you can see what its leaves look like here. See, it's alternating or sub-opposite to alternate. And the native range is Central America. And the hardiness, yeah, it does 10 to 11. But yeah, I'm not sure I've seen it further north in West Palm Beach. I know that there are other examples of this and parks and gardens in other places in Miami-Dade County. And so I don't know the full extent. I don't know if you could get all the way up to like Port St. Lucie, for example, with it. You might be pushing it there. So wind resistance, it's probably medium because of the fact that it's not a big tree. It's not like it's really super dense wood or anything like that either. But generally, most small trees are going to be in that neighborhood of medium wind resistance. So low maintenance, it prefers wet sites, but it's also like a lot of things in the passion flower family, it's attracted to butterflies and hummingbirds. It's called Flor de Fuego. So, I mean, the flower of fire. In a few places, if you look for it online, if you go to some of the sourcing websites, it's around. You can get it. It's not super common, but it's something that you can get, as opposed to some of the things I'm going to show you, you might not be able to find. So here's just some more photos of it. Just, I mean, to me, it's like you could take, these images of it, and these are real life examples. Like it looks like a Hawaiian shirt. It looks like somebody's floral Hawaiian shirt. And I think it looks pretty nice. So here's a Mommy Americana. This is another one that it's not native, but it's from the area, the Caribbean. And it has a pretty excurrent form. If you were to look at the mature trees of this without paying close attention, you would probably think a lot of times that they're magnolia trees. So it has very large glossy leaves and a very similar form to like Magnolia grandiflora, so southern magnolia. However, there's one big key difference here is that the leaves are opposite. So if you are trying to make the ID in a pinch, like that's going to be one of your go-tos a lot of the time. There's just not as many plants out there that have those opposite leaves. But overall, it is something that could probably use more, but just in the right place. The reason I say the right place is because this thing puts out huge fruit, and it puts out a lot of them. So it's technically a 4 to 8 inch wide berry, and they have brown, thick exterior with an edible yellow-orange flesh, and it produces from about July to November each year. And we have one in the garden here at the Mounts Botanical Garden, and the ground is just covered in these large fruit. In fact, they circled the tree off with tape because the fruit coming off of these things could potentially hurt quite a bit if you were to be hit by them. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's native to the Caribbean basin. It's hardy from 10B to 12. Again, I'm not sure how it's going to perform on the periphery of like that 10B. That's just what I pulled off of like one of the USDA websites, but I'm not sure I've seen this one north of Palm Beach either. So I'd be curious to hear anything if anybody has seen them further up the coast at all. Wind resistance unknown, but it's probably medium to high. I think this one does have pretty dense wood, and but I would say maybe the down part of this is I think a lot of opposite trees tend to have more problems because with risk features, because it's just more likely that they're going to have branches coming out from the same area and having weak points. So maybe not the highest, but I would feel pretty comfortable putting this one somewhere in the medium range at least. And an interesting side note about this thing, there's a lot of medicinal uses associated with it. There have been insecticides made from the bark, and then people that take the seed from inside and powderize it, grind it up. And then also liqueurs and alcoholic drinks have been made from the flower and sap. So here's what it looks like, the fruit itself. Let's see here. It may not be, if you just see the skin, it doesn't look very appetizing. It looks like a giant round potato, basically, or an air potato. But when you cut it open, it's got this pretty decent amount of like orange flesh in there. And a lot of people compare the flavor, I guess, to apricot. I mean, I think that I would almost try and throw it in there with star fruit a little bit, but it's a little bit firmer than a lot of those. So it's really interesting. Not everybody likes it, but some people like it a lot. So in our office, we had everybody try it. Most people liked it for the moment. But then again, you never know until you go out there and try it. I really think it has potential for people to like it and even potentially be grown commercially. Okay, I'm gonna drop out a second here because I just need to let people in from the waiting room. And then I'm gonna go back to sharing. Okay. So continuing on, the next tree that I'm going to bring on here, talk about is the cotton tree or the red kapok. Its name varies depending on who you talk to, but it's a member of the Malvaceae, which is interesting because Malvaceae is the family that true cotton is a member of. So maybe there's something going on there in terms of having the genes or the ability to make a puffy white material within these pods here. But this is a very large tree when it gets to be mature, up to 75 feet tall, generally here in Florida. And it's an interesting one because it is deciduous. You can see the leaf here too. It's palmately compound, which not a lot of things do that. So these are all really key IDs, but it does have this really columnar excurrent form to it. So the flower is really, really conspicuous. It's waxy, large, red, cup-shaped. And usually it flowers at some point between February and April for about a month or so. And then eventually, like what's produced into the summer are these capsules. And you can see this is where it gets its name, is that inside the capsule, there's this cottony material. So that the seeds are coated in, and then like that, the seeds will break off from that, and then they'll get taken up in the wind and moved around and dispersed that way. So here's a view looking up into the canopy of one of these. You see that like the flowers are those are not small leaves, and those flowers are quite large overall. And it's a native tree to South India, Southeast Asia, and all the way up to Northern Australia. So hardiness, like most things in here, somewhere between 10 and 12. And wind resistance, it's probably not a very high wind resistant species. This it might be medium to medium low. And the reason for this is that the wood of this tree is not super dense. A lot of people, when they see this, they think, wow, that's got a nice long bowl on the tree there. It would probably be great for lumber because of that. Because that's what everybody wants, is how many different boards can you get out of one bowl, basically. And that would be good for that if the wood was actually dense. So on the other hand, it's got good excurrent form, which is really something that you can't say that, like, trees with low density, a lot of times they don't always have this nice form. Like, and I guess what comes to mind here is maybe like the ear tree, Pterolobium. Super, they can get to be pretty big. They're common up in parts of Central Florida and South Florida, and they break apart very easily. This tree, but they're also not excurrent. So it's a little, and I know that, like, I've seen these survive like hurricanes before too, and like remain relatively intact. So, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have enough data to really say for sure where it's at, because this is an interesting one because it has traits that kind of go against each other. But I mean, it's something that is still suitable here. And there are examples of very large trees of this in Florida that have made it through pretty nasty wind. So another cool thing about this one is that it has spiny stems when it's younger. As it outgrows it, as it grows, it outgrows the spines. The bark becomes smoother, and it usually develops like buttressing, as you can see in this photo here from Selby Gardens. It's got a nice buttressed flare like going on towards the bottom of the tree. So here's just another close-up photo of the flowers. If you ever go online and look up other people on extension that have done videos on this, there's a Stephen Brown from Southwest Florida. I mean, there's literally videos of him, like, it'll collect a lot of water, and it will, in the bottom of the cups of the flower, there's a lot of nectar that builds up with the water that it collects, and it can be quite sweet. People drink from it. I'm not advocating this, but I mean, Stephen does it in the video, so it's kind of an interesting little side note about that one. So banana shrub, or some people know this one as port wine magnolia. I think port wine is referenced in one of the cultivars of it. For a long time, people were calling this Michelia, but I guess they've done work on it, and they're currently putting it lumping it in with the rest of the magnolias. So it is a member of the Magnoliaceae. There's quite a few things in there, and this one is actually a shrub, because you feel like that you should try and call it a tree, but when we call banana tree, we still think of like the banana plants that are technically not trees. This is a tree. It just has a flower that smells a lot like a banana. So the form is up to 15 feet or so by 10 feet width. They don't get to be very huge. There's a good example of one of these in the if you ever make it to Orange County Extension, the garden that they have behind it, there's a pretty large one. It's probably about the biggest that you would expect to find it. So it's probably 15, maybe even 20 feet tall. So the leaf, it's alternate, simple, evergreen, waxy. It's a magnolia. It fits in pretty well with that, like, as well. Which, I mean, they're glossy at least, but there's not a whole lot that stand out about these leaves necessarily. The big thing about this one is the flower. They tend to be creamy yellow to a maroon color, and it blooms from April to June typically. So Here's some examples of the flowers. You can see that they have a variety of colors available, as I mentioned. And the interesting thing about this one is it's native to Southeast China and Korea. These places are kind of cold. So this is one that actually is a little bit more of one of these temperate species. And like here in South Florida, we're kind of at the lower end of where this thing can be planted. So this might be one that you can still get away with for planting in Palm Beach County, that area, but I'm not sure it's going to do super well like down in Homestead, for example. Wind resistance, it's really small. It's probably going to be able to hold up somewhat to hurricane force winds because of that. It's just going to be collecting a lot less force against it. And it can be susceptible to false and oleander scale. It grows slowly, but it's also popular as a houseplant because of the fact that like it can be potted, and people will leave it outside during the summer and bring it inside during the winter. But yeah, it has a really nice smell. It smells kind of yummy. It smells like something that you should be able to eat, but I don't think that the flowers are edible or anything like that, but they definitely smell like they could be something that could be eaten. Okay, so here's one that we kind of wish overall there was more of these in the landscape. Large native trees are not super common overall, like within urban landscapes, except for maybe live oaks and maybe mahoganies. So, and like I said, that's kind of us over relying on some of these things that maybe would not be a great thing in the long run if we just kept, I guess, on the same trajectory in terms of their use. We need to try and inject some other things into that these spaces, and this is really one that we should consider. It's the false mastic or Cider-Xylon fidecidum. So it's in the Sapitaceae, which is an interesting family. If you guys are familiar with mamey tree, this is one that's in the same family as mamey. And it actually does produce a fruit too. I'll get into that a little bit here further on. But it has a form of 70 feet tall by about 50 feet wide. And it's got a simple alternate glossy leaf. Pretty inconspicuous, but still definitely has a tropical look to it. The flowers have kind of an unpleasant odor, which kind of makes sense. That's where it gets its scientific name from, feticidum. So it's got a fetid smell. And the fruit, though, it produces an orange-yellow drupe. It's technically edible. I don't think that it's really noteworthy in any way, though. So here's some examples of the fruit and the flower. So these are photos that are actually from trees in the Bahamas, but probably pretty similar to what we'd see here. And you can see, and here's an example of a mature tree. This is in the urban area, and actually this is from Dominican Republic. But this is a tree that grows pretty far north along the coast, all the way up to Volusia County. So, and it's got hardiness all the way from 10 to 11. And this is one that we actually have enough data on to say that it's in the medium-high range. It's not the highest, but medium-high is a pretty good place to be. And actually the mahoganies are within that same category. So it's got a really high salt tolerance. That's something that we like to see a lot. And it's fast growing. The roots can buttress over time, which is another nice, cool feature. And the wood is really heavy. It has been a really valuable tree in the Caribbean for making boats and that type of thing, like when it is available. In a lot of places, it's been over harvested, and there's really not a super ton or a super huge amount of these trees that are mature and really big, all like I think in the world at this point. It's got a specific pest though. So it's called it's the false mastic scilla. And so just as something, if you get something on the leaves that look like scale, so that's the immatures, and then eventually it'll turn into this winged scilla adult. So just something to be aware of. Hopefully that it, if it's like I mentioned, different plants have key pests. We know that this one has it. Is it really that big of an issue? I can't say for sure. If it became more widespread, would it become even more of an issue? We don't know. But with that said, it's something that is probably pretty controllable in many ways. We control scales and all sorts of things. So I know these aren't true scales, but it's the same premise here. It'd be feeding the same way. So, oh, and another cool thing about this one too is that like its fruit is related to I guess the miracle fruit. So that's another relative of the mamey. So that's just another cool thing that this one is kind of close. It's actually within the same genus, the Sideroxylon, unless they've revised that recently. So, and here's just an example for plant ant. You can get it from various places throughout the state, but yeah, mostly here in South Florida. It's available somewhat better than some of the other things I listed on there. But it would be a good one that we're hoping that like we'll have more increased availability and usage throughout time here. Pink shower. This is one that is kind of similar to another one I think that is kind of used like that people call, I think it's called the apple shower tree, or but this is one that is probably not used quite as commonly, and it's gaining popularity. And with a lot of these shower trees, they're all cassias. They've got a really decurrent form. So this one in particular is probably not a great one if you're really worried about wind damage. The branches tend to be pretty spindly on these things too. But it grows to about 30 foot by 30 foot. It's got nice big pinnately compound leaves, very, very nice tropical aesthetic to it. And the flowers, they tend to be very intense when they do flower. And they're large, deep pink to white. And they usually last about 40 days, and it's somewhere between late March to mid-May. For all the cassias, they tend to produce big cylindrical pods. So I think that this one is not any different. So here's the one that we have here in Mounts Botanical Garden. Beautiful tree, really stands out in the landscape. My friend Tia from Hillsborough County coming and checking out the tropical plants down here. So this is one that we stopped by, and I had to take photos for because I knew I'd be presenting on these trees at some point here. So here's some more photos of this tree. You can see an up close of the flowers, but when they flower, it really is just flowers on this tree. There's no leaves or anything like that. And that is because this tree is semi-deciduous. If you were to go out and look at the tree right now, it would have in the garden, that same one I showed you, it would not have a whole lot of leaves in it. And yeah, it's another one that's from Southeast Asia. But yeah, just a beautiful tree. And here is an example of what the tree does look like right now. So I just took this picture a couple days ago. It's not beautiful. This is something like during the middle of the winter. Unfortunately, this is something that would not be great for areas or places that are going to be really frequented by snowbirds because of that. But if you're really concerned about a lot of events or things like that in the middle of the winter, but if you are here year round, it's really just it's a beautiful option to have. So, I mean, it just looks a lot like if you've ever go up to the temperate areas where cherry blossoms are, this is our version of that basically. And it's interesting that it's in the Fabaceae. So it's not even closely related, but it just has that same effect. So Montezuma cypress, bald cypress. This is a close relative of the bald cypress, but it's from Mexico. And the thing that is really interesting about this one is that it has a cut. It's almost in every single way the same tree. In fact, it wasn't until I believe the 1970s that they separated these two into another species. And but there's a couple traits that are really important about it that could see it be used more here. In appearance, most people aren't going to notice the difference between this monozygote cypress and the bald cypress. But the thing that stands out is that it tends to produce leaves that don't deciduate nearly as strongly during the winter. So our bald cypresses that we have here, they'll lose their leaves during the winter. This one tends to hang on to them, which can be pretty key, as I mentioned, for certain places where that's something that people are concerned about, that appearance. And I would go so far, it's not technically native to here. It's not going to have the same genetics as here. But is it, like I mentioned, this is one that was not separated until recently. It still acts like the regular bald cypress in many ways. It'll have the same pests. It'll have the same things living on it. If you're concerned about biodiversity of insects and animals that are attracted to certain trees, this tree is going to fill in very well. The other thing that is a little bit different about this one is that it does not tend to produce a lot of the cypress knees like the standard bald cypress does that we're familiar with. The pond cypress tends to produce less of these knees too. But this one is on this, it's just another thing to consider, is that those knees can be really bad in urban areas where there's a lot of mowing and stuff going on for maintenance. And so that's just another thing that's in this tree's favor. So here's the traditional range. You can see here that the Mexican populations were separated in the 1970s into a separate species. It does have a few little different traits. I don't think it grows quite as strong as a excurrent form as our natives. So, or as our native Taxodium gesticum, which might be a concern for some people. But I still think overall these are strong trees. They hold up the wind pretty well. It definitely deserves some consideration. You can see here, it grows right along the Rio Grande. And if you look at where it's available or being grown, Texas nurseries grow it quite a bit. And you can see here, this is taken from a landscape within Texas. So, and actually one of the largest trees in the world in terms of diameter is this tree. And I think it's called the Arbola, and actually it is where a long time ago, the native people that were there planted these trees in a circular pattern, and they fused together to form one giant trunk. So just a really cool, ingenious way because of creating a gigantic tree that has a huge amount of cultural significance to this day. So continuing like with the conifers here, I'm going to cover another conifer that is until recently was considered to be a podocarpus. It's been regrouped into Afrocarpus. And this one has a fairly excurrent form as well. I think that they've seen that it does hold up pretty decently to wind. And it gets to be a pretty large tree. It gets to be up to 60 feet. So it's native to Eastern Africa, but it does, and hence why it's called Afrocarpus. They split off like the Podocarpaceae that were from that region into their own group. And like it isn't another just interesting evergreen that has more potential in the South Florida landscape. We've got a pretty big one here in the Mounts Botanical Garden. But it's a it's kind of hard to show it. I didn't get a lot of great photos of it, so I'm showing you like other examples that I've had here. But it's likely at least the medium range for wind resistance. All the podocarpuses, for the most part, have pretty high wind resistance, but there's just not enough data out there to really say for sure. It's not super tolerant of drought, and it can be used as a hedge in some cases, but that's true for regular podocarpus as well that we think of, the classic type. So here's the base of the stem, the trunk, pretty interesting bark. I just wanted to point that out too, that like that's something that's kind of attractive about this tree. So this is one that is called Nagi podocarpus, or some people call it the Nagi tree or broadleafed podocarpus. And it used to be like within the genus of podocarpus too, but they split it off into Nagia. And it has a really pyramidal excurrent form. As you can see, it's got a broad leaf. If you were to look at the leaf on this thing, you would assume that it was not a conifer. A lot of time, unless you knew what you're looking at, it really looks like it's a broadleaf tree. So it's dioecious. So there are male trees, there are female trees. You can see, I tried to pick out some examples here. A female that has the berry on it. And I guess it's actually a cone, technically. And then the male flower. So it's from Southeast Asia. Hardiness from 9A through 11. I haven't seen as many of these here in South Florida compared to Central Florida, but I think based off of what I've seen, like that they should perform pretty well here as well. And it makes sense. Our environment is very similar to where they're from natively. Taiwan and the southern part of China and Japan. However, there's a pretty big caveat with this tree. It grows very slowly. It can take many years for it to reach its mature height of about 40 feet or so. And it's considered to be a sacred tree in Japan. As you can see here, here's like a Shinto site where these trees have been planted as kind of, I guess, as a sacred aspect of the site. So other thing to highlight about this is that it has a really high potential for wind tolerance. They believe it may be one of the most wind tolerant species in the world. And it makes sense given that like its native range, it would have been the equivalent of where we're at, but like on the Pacific side, an area that just gets smacked by like hurricanes and tropical, well, I guess it would be typhoons there, but tropical cyclone activity is very, very high where these plants are from. And so they've adapted it evolutionarily accordingly. And so, and the reason I could say that, like, yeah, that it has really high wind resistance is because, I mean, there's not a ton of data out there. It is somewhat anecdotal, but people that have had them in their gardens, people that have had them in their neighborhoods have said, oh yeah, all the trees in my neighborhood or the garden there was damage all over the place, but these trees basically had no damage to them. So it just has a really strong form. And I guess the way that the fibers line up on these things, like they just hold up really well. So here's two examples of some of the bigger ones in the Orlando area. The one on the left hand or on the right hand side is actually in Lou Gardens. Here is an example of it growing up in Gainesville. You can see it's actually starting to move the sidewalk here. So, but it was planted in a pretty dense space. People like to plant them kind of as shrubs, but because they kind of have that shape and can be shaped over time. But if they're neglected, they will eventually turn into pretty large trees. Okay, here's the last tree I'm going to cover here. This is mountain pear or mahaguia. It's an interesting one. It's in the Malvaceae family. It's another one within the hibiscus or cotton family. Grows up to 65 feet. So it can be pretty big. And we're looking for large trees that we can use, like that are adapted to like our environment. And this one seems to be one that people don't know a whole lot about. We have them here in the botanical garden at Mounts, and they seem to be doing quite well. So there might be potential for them to grow here. We've got a pretty simple leaf, deltoid in shape, cordate at the base. And the flowers, from what I was able to find, like they're dioecious. They're violet in color. So not all, I think only the females are going to produce these really showy flowers. And I'm not sure, because the garden that we have here, we might only have female trees. I haven't been able to find any of these trees producing offspring at all. So it's one I'm paying attention to, and I'm hoping that there's potential for this tree. So here I mentioned that, like, I tried to have photos of the trees when they're not blooming. Here's the same tree that I showed you in the previous slide. Right now, it blooms during the summer. So this is what it looks like right now without anything on it, any flowers. As I mentioned, it's native to this area, but Mexico, Cuba, hence the name cubensis, and I think Haiti. So doesn't make it all the way up to the Keys. So, but this is a pretty similar environment in many ways to like South Florida. So how far north can it be planted? We're not really sure. But it's probably like a lot of the other ones that we've covered here, like hardiness 10 to 12. Wind resistance, I don't know for sure, but I mean, it looks like that they've held up pretty well so far. I'll let you know for sure once we get smacked by a big hurricane here. There's just not many examples of this down here, but apparently there are mature trees in various parts of Miami-Dade. I went and looked at like the voucher system on the Florida Botanical Atlas, and there are mature trees throughout southern Florida. So I mean, apparently they have been able to grow to maturity without being knocked over. Just here's a close-up of the flowers. There tend to be more of them towards the apex of the tree, towards the top, and they're just much more clustered up there. So in summary, just breaking the trees down from medium to large trees and then small to medium. Just if you want this list, I know I'm going to send everybody that attended here the PowerPoint, or the recording of this PowerPoint. And then I really want to come back and do more of this. You can see here, there's a lot of trees that were potentially on this list, but I can't go on for 2 or 3 hours. Like I'm limited here in terms of what I can show you all. So, but I would love to down the road here, make this kind of a series and kind of cover other options that are out there and try and promote some of these other species that might have potential for working their way more commonly into our landscapes. So in other places that might be places for inspiration, Montgomery Botanical Center in Coral Gables has a huge, I mean, that's literally what they're in the business of, is trying to show the diversity of plants that are out there that can be grown in Florida. And it's a refuge, genetic refuge for plants that might not make it in the wild all that much longer too. It's kind of a plant zoo almost, in that sense, where conservation is the ideal. But there are various other gardens. I mean, you can go to any Fairchild, Mounts. There's any of the gardens around here will probably have a good selection of trees that you might not see all that commonly and can be inspired by. But Blue Gardens in Orlando, I know that's kind of on the edge here. They've got some interesting things in their collection. Selby Gardens in Sarasota, Edison Ford Winter Estate in Fort Myers, Naples Botanical Garden, And the fruit and spice park like has some pretty interesting things too, especially if you're on the side of trying to find edible type plants for the landscape. So here is my contact information. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. And I'm going to go ahead and give you all the quiz again that I promised. Okay, quiz should be going here. Okay, I got a question about ISA credits. There should have been a field that you filled out like when you that when you bought a ticket, like for ISA CEUs, like that you included your information. If for some reason you do not include it, we have everyone's information that attended. We can contact you. So just go ahead and like be aware, like, and there can be a little bit of a delay too. The last one we did, it took like a month for it to go through. So that's just maybe the time of year for ISA. I don't know what was happening there, but just be aware that we have a way to like with the tickets, we should have collected that information already. So yeah, we'll follow up if we don't have it. So the admin assistant that works in this office, like she's really dedicated towards that type of stuff. So thank you. I hope that I that some of these were interesting or ones that you do not see or did not know about. I know that there are plenty of really knowledgeable people out there. And if you have any trees that you think deserve to be on the underutilized lists that we're working on, or trees that deserve to be promoted, please reach out to me. Like, I mean, we're working on like trying to come out with it like a flyer and infographic on these trees. I guess another good resource out there, like a variety of resources. One of them that's probably pretty good is that the Florida Urban Forestry Council puts out a poster, and they updated the list that was going to be on the poster for South Florida right before COVID. And the other, I don't know what happened, but the South Florida version did not get updated yet. There's not been, it hasn't gone into publication. North and Central Florida went into publication. The South Florida has not, and it has a lot of really cool, interesting trees that deserve to be promoted more on there. In terms of other resources, there's some good books out there. Let's see here. We turn off learn my background. Native trees and shrubs, Florida Keys in South Florida, like that's where a lot of these natives come from. They're more like, it's more like that we're the very northern part of the Caribbean, basically. And so this is a pretty good, it's kind of an older book, but it still holds up pretty well. Tropical Trees of Florida and the Virgin Islands. The author, Kent Kirk, he was a USDA scientist for years. And so he was, I mean, he was doing work out of the Virgin Islands, and a lot of these trees carry over to Florida as well. So he comments on that as well. So pretty interesting one as well. My old boss, Andrew Kozer, he came out with this one several years ago. Trees of South Florida and the Key. keys. So it's more of a pocket guide, one you can carry along with you. But it's got a lot of pictures, which is a really nice thing. A lot of these guides don't have a ton of pictures in them, and that's a really nice thing about this one. If you have the chance to find this old, it's old now. It makes me feel old because I remember this book when it came out. It came out in about like 2005 or so. Tropical and Subtropical Trees, an encyclopedia. Margaret Barnwick, I think she was a landscape architect, and just a great resource. It doesn't get into every tree that's out there, but it gets really close in terms of it'll kind of cover the most popular trees within a genus, and then it'll provide a couple photos of like less popular ones or ones that are less known. And just really, some of the stuff is getting kind of outdated in terms of the taxonomy, the names of the plants and that type of thing. But just to really, I mean, I could just look at that book for hours because there's just so much knowledge, so much resources within there. So yeah, I hope that helps. And I guess stay tuned for the Florida Urban Forestry Council's poster. I really think that's going to be a game changer as well, because everybody's got those. So okay, I'm looking at the chat here. Okay, nothing too big. So yeah, I guess like I mentioned, if anyone knows like the of trees that might be good for this list for us to keep adding to, please feel free to contact out to me, and reach out to me and contact us. You really want to know, because I mean, it's a fickle environment out there, and we need trees that can survive and do well. And we don't want to promote like every tree. We know right plant, right place is key, but if we can really pick out some of them that are particularly sturdy and hold up to our environment, all the better. So with that, I'm going to get going. Thank you all for being here. We will be having an updated calendar come out soon for all of our speakers. For this series is going to continue into 2024. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with everybody here in the near future. So we've got you on our lists, and we'll continue to keep you posted on like the presentations and opportunities for learning like in the near future. So with that, everybody have a happy holiday season, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in 2024.